Morning, everybody. My name is Ian Lurie, and I'm here today to give you a very quick 40-minute tour of technical SEO. I want to say thanks to Serpstat for hosting this. And because of how much content there is, I'm just going to kind of jump right into it. If you have questions or anything, post them in the chat, and Frankie should get them to me. So let me just get started here. You may hear a cat occasionally. I work from home now. They're amazing, but they can be a real pain in the neck sometimes. Anyone who has a cat knows what I mean. If I suddenly disconnect or something, it's probably because a cat walked across my keyboard. I'll reconnect as quick as I possibly can. So this was originally titled The Full Technical SEO Audit in 3 Easy Steps. That is such a total lie. You can't do it in 3 easy steps. That's completely hopeless. If you're watching now, you just saw a cat jump into my lap. It's amazing, really. They hear the webinar start and then there they are. They just jump right in. Anyway, this is really more a full audit in 300 easy steps, and they're not so easy. And I'm just warning you that because you're going to feel at the end of this as if you were being stuffed full of more information than you could possibly get in 8 hours, never mind 40 minutes. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that because there's just a lot of stuff here, and I had to make a lot of choices about how detailed I wanted to get and how much information I actually wanted to deliver in just 40 minutes. So what I tried to do is stick to an outline and give you the tools so that you can then run with it. So the first thing to understand is the 2 basic principles here. Technical SEO minimizes the work required by teams and bots to create and interpret content. So on the one hand, it minimizes work, right? It's trying to make it easier for teams and crawlers to do what they need to do with their content. On the other hand, it's supposed to maximize flexibility when they try to create or interpret that content. That's all going to make more sense in a minute. First, though, I want to make sure that we get some tools together. And obviously, you don't have to do this right now. This is being recorded, and you can come back and look later. The first thing you need is the command line. And I'm just going to check some notes here very, very quickly. Good. The first tool you need is the command line, or some alternative, which is almost never as good. But you need a place where you can go and execute commands that are not run using some third-party tool. Things like curl and grep, things I'll talk about in a minute. It'll make a lot more sense if you don't know what those are. You need some kind of crawler. And you've probably heard of things like, Serpstat or somebody like that. I will admit, I use Screaming Frog a lot. I am not necessarily partial to one or the other. I'm not endorsing one. I've just spent a lot of time using Screaming Frog. The company that I used to own and run, Portent, built their own crawler. And I also have access to that, so I use that sometimes. That's quite a bit more elaborate and lets me do a little bit more. It gives me a little more flexibility. I probably should say, by the way, I used to own and run a company called Portent that I sold 2 years ago, and I'm now out on my own as a consultant. Sorry, I'm not very good at this whole self-promotional thing. I usually just jump right into the content. So anyway, you want to learn whatever crawler you have inside out. You need to know every single feature. You also need some kind of log file analyzer. Screaming Frog has one. There's one by a company called Splunk. That one is very expensive. And there's also just grep, which is a command line tool that I already mentioned once, and I'll give you more details on later. You need to understand dev tools. Now, this is a tool set that's built into most browsers, Firefox, Brave, Chrome, and it gives you insight into a lot of different ways that web pages are behaving when your browser tries to load them. And that's really, really helpful when you're trying to do some of the deeper SEO that we're going to look at today. In DevTools, by the way, this is how you find DevTools in your browser. So just click View, Developer, and then Developer Tools. I just wanted to point that out real quick if you haven't seen it before. Web Developer Toolbar, it's a really simple plugin for Firefox and Chrome. I'm not sure if it's available for Brave. It just lets you do things like turn off JavaScript, which is the most important thing that I'm going to talk about today. Because yes, JavaScript is an SEO problem, whether you like it or not. And yes, we'll talk and argue about that later on. So when you're doing a technical audit, you're looking at 3 things. You're looking at how easy it is to build the site and how it was built. You're looking at how crawlers and browsers in general are able to crawl and access different pieces of content on a site using links. And then you're looking at how difficult or easy it is for a visiting client, a browser, a bot, or any user agent to render and index and display that content. And I'm going to start with build. This is the thing that most people ignore. Most technical SEOs do not, or I shouldn't say most, A lot of technical SEOs ignore this one really important part of the technology behind a site, which is, does the site work? Now you forget about whether it can be crawled or whether it can be rendered. Is the site actually going to work? Can you add stuff? The first thing to check here is, do you have enough storage? And that's not enough storage for what you have right now. That's enough storage for later and to compensate for the fact that we all lie to ourselves. So the formula is your current average page size times 1.5. That's the part where we lie to ourselves, because we'll say things to ourselves like, oh yeah, our average page size is 1 megabyte, when really our average page size is more like 1.5 megabytes. So you put that in there. Number of pages, obviously, and then your growth rate. So if your growth rate is 150%, then you're going to end up with a 1.5 using 1 plus growth rate divided by 100. I'm not suggesting you don't know how to do math. I, however, do not know how to do math, which is why I put that in there. So for a site that has 500 pages with an average page size of 2 megabytes, which, by the way, gives me a stomach ache because no page should be 2 megabytes. But anyway, you're going to need about 2.2 gigs of storage, assuming that the site's going to grow at a rate of 150% over the course of a year. So it's important to keep that in mind. You can always get more storage, right? What you don't want to do is end up getting more storage after your site has suddenly slowed down, or your web hosting providers come back and charge you some ridiculous amount of money because they had to give you burst storage or sudden growth in storage without you requesting it. Next in site build is, how hard is it to measure SEO performance, right? Do you have the tools in place to measure how well that site is tracking its ability to deliver organic traffic? Before you think about web analytics, and we'll get there in a minute, you got to think about how your site is logging data. So make sure that your log files are storing data in some format that's similar to or exactly the same as W3C extended format. And that means you're storing the date, the request, the requested resource, the refer, the page from which the request came, the response code, 200, 300, whatever, and then the user agent. You need these 3 pieces of information. That's the minimum, because that's going to tell you when the resource was requested, what it was, obviously, where it came from, how the server responded, and whether it was a browser or a bot, so that later you can filter your log files and look at bot behavior. You want to look at whether Google Search Console is set up. It needs to be. I mean, I don't love Search Console. I don't think it's terribly accurate, but it's the only direct feedback we get from Google, aside from bot behavior. So it's pretty important that you have access to this data and this information. Just get it set up. It's easy to do. If it's not set up, at least put it on the list, make the request. If you're not the one in charge of running the site, just make sure that it's there, or at least that it's in the queue to be set up. Bing Webmaster Tools. This is an interesting one. People say, oh, it's Bing, it doesn't get that much traffic, it doesn't generate that much traffic. Do I really need it? It delivers some useful information, and I always figure, why not? You can actually import your profile from Google Search Console and give permission to access it that way. So it's pretty easy. You can also, do the typical deliver a unique string in the from your server, from a meta tag, or in a server header. So it's not that hard to set up, and you get to look at a lot of interesting data that you might not get using Google. It'll show you things like geotargeting behavior. It'll show you. It'll just give you a second opinion on things like security issues and other diagnostics. So I almost always set it up. There's no reason not to. And then obviously Google Analytics or something similar, right? You need some kind of analytics tool that will give you organic traffic. It sounds ridiculous. But I just spent some time working with a potential client trying to get log files and analytics data for their site, and their e-commerce platform would provide neither. And no, I will not tell you what e-commerce platform it is. At least not online. If you want to hear offline, I can tell you about it. And then you need on-site search tracking. And a lot of folks, when I ask them about this, they look at me and they're like, why would I want to track on-site search tracking? And then I look at them and say, why wouldn't you? Are you stoned? Are you actually high? Because there is no reason I can possibly think of not to track on-site search. If you can see what people search for when they land on your site and tailor your content around those searches, forget about Google and Bing. You're optimizing for the most important searches that happen, right? The stuff that people search for on your site. it's also obviously really powerful insight into how people find you and what they want to find. Because if you can optimize your site externally, if you do SEO around on-site search, then you're optimizing for the things that people most want to see. You may not get a ton more traffic, but you're going to get much higher quality traffic. And in Google Analytics, it's easy to set up, right? You click the little on off that says site search tracking, and then you put in your query parameter. That's it. There's no additional configuration. If you already have Google Analytics set up, that's all you have to do. And then there's a ton of the custom site search tools out there that include their own analytics, like Lurie and stuff like that. The next rule, and sorry, that was another cat shoving incident. I'm really nice to my cats. I just want to point that out. Okay, they're wonderful, but if they're actually going to step on the keyboard, I have to stop them. Okay, anyway, can your authors create SEO ready content? Right, that's a pretty important question. Are they able to edit title tags and meta descriptions and alt attributes and schema and relevant fields and links? If they can't, obviously that's going to cause problems and you don't want to have to deal with it later. I've actually had clients where you have to do a code release in order to roll out new title tags and things. Again, I have to ask, are you high? I mean, seriously, is your weed as good as it sounds? Because that must be amazing if you think that's okay. It should not require developer intervention to edit basic things like title tags and description tags and even schema. Although schema, I'm sympathetic because a lot of content management systems out there don't handle schema particularly well. Is the site easy to maintain? This is different from content, and this is where there's more of a sliding scale. So I always look at challenge level. So if I need to compress an image, that should be something a typical author can do, assuming that they understand how to do it. So if I use squoosh.app and I can press an image, then I, as an author, should be able to just upload that compressed image. I should not have to go to a developer or a producer to do that. On the other hand, if I want to change navigation, I don't think authors should be able to do that. People may argue with me on that, but I don't think someone writing content for a website should necessarily be able to actually change a menu. And you're going to see a cattail again. This is so unprofessional. I'm so sorry. But they're my cats. What can I say? Now I'm going to sound obsessive. If the dog goes running by in a minute, I apologize there too. I'm not just the crazy cat guy. So adding a field to a database, right? Adding an additional chunk of content that's added to a page, like a secondary title or something like that. We're actually modifying the database. That's closer to a full stack developer, right? And then if someone's going to tune server performance, that's really challenging, and that should require someone approaching a full stack developer. But it needs to sit on that spectrum. And again, these are little things that most technical SEOs ignore, but can have significant costs down the line. So when you're starting your audit, look here first. Next up is the crawl, right? What's happening when a bot actually visits your site? And this is where most SEOs start. Don't crawl your site yet. Okay, this is not yet about checking the server, how your server behaves when you point a crawler at it. This is looking first at how your site behaves when Google points a crawler at your site. So first thing is, what is Google crawling, right? And you want to see whether Google page count approximates site page count. And so here's an example. I have a client who their site had, whoops, and I just gave away their site address. Okay, that's awkward. I have a client whose site, and this was a while ago, their site had about 2,000 pages on it. And of those 2,000 pages, with those 2,000 URLs, Google showed in their index 522,000 pages. Something is wrong there, right? That's causing a problem. We're going to come back to that in a minute, but that's the first sort of alarm bell to me that I'm going to need to dig deeper into this. Are the right files in place? So robots.txt, really obvious, but you need to check robots.txt really carefully because you'd be amazed some of the stuff that happens. Like I've seen people put spaces in to lines of code in the robots.txt and cause themselves no end of grief, because even though the protocol says spaces aren't a problem and Google says spaces aren't a problem, spaces can be a big problem, and you really need to be prepped and alert and aware and ready for that. You need to check these files carefully, and think like think like an OCD Linux person like me and make sure that everything is just so, right? That there are no inappropriate spaces or dashes or anything else. Make sure XML sitemaps exist and are correct. And yeah, this is ianlurie.com, and it's a new site, and I've only written like 9 pages on it, so that's kind of a sad little site. But the main thing is, I know that my sitemaps are here, and there's a couple of errors, but not many. And given that my site is as small as it is, I can tell you the reason the gallery and portfolio are returning errors is because there is nothing there. But anyway, like I said, sad little site. Main thing is just making sure that they exist and they're correct. And you want to take a quick look at them. Don't just go into Google Search Console and say, oh yeah, everything's right, because you may see things like this. Last mod or last modified is an optional field. And depending how it's being updated, you may send a very incorrect signal to Google. Like if your last mod says December 12th, but you actually updated it on December 17th, but you're not updating your sitemaps more than once every 2 weeks, then you just sent Google a signal that your content, which updated, actually never updated. So what I usually tell clients to do is just not have last mod at all, but that's just me. Is your server delivering the correct response codes? Again, this is something that I think technical SEOs generally get right, but not all the time, because what they'll do is they'll point, say, a crawler at it, like Screaming Frog, or they'll use their browser and check the request response that they get using IEMA or something like that. And the problem is if there's JavaScript redirection, or if there's any user agent redirection, looking to see if it's a browser or not, you may get an inaccurate response. So instead, I like to go to the command line and I use curl. And curl is a pretty simple tool that avoids JavaScript redirection. It also gives you a more complete picture because it shows you response headers and things like that when you request a resource. And here's how the command works. So you type in curl, obviously, that's the command. And then -I, which says -I, which says just show me the headers, right? And then at this URL, this is the address I want to request. You're doing all this at the command line. And it seems kind of arcane when you start, but it gets simpler the more you do it. And you're going to get a response that looks like this. Continuing on. Once you use curl, and this is the command, you're going to get a response. And you're going to see a response that looks like this. Yeah, let me know. This slide should show HTTP 200. Okay, good. This is a good response, right? I've requested my home page and I get a 200 response because that page exists and that's what I should see there. Then what I do is I will deliberately type in an incorrect URL. So here I typed in ianlurie.com/ASD, just because I know that's a page that doesn't exist on my site. And I get a 404 response. And if you've been doing this for a while, you know 404 means this page doesn't exist. That's the response I want. I do not want to see a 301 response if I type in a URL that does not exist. I'm going to come back to that in a second. If I type in an address that should redirect, so here it's ianlurie.com, which should redirect to www.ianlurie.com, then I want to see a 301 because that's a permanent redirect, right? That's just telling the server, that's just telling the browser, okay, I want to see this other page and I want to see it forever. This is what you should not see. If you're seeing this, again, there is weed involved. If you type in curl-I, your address /incorrect URL, you should not see a 301 redirect. A 301 redirect is incorrect. That is not what should be happening because that page does not exist. If the page doesn't exist, then it should be sending a 404 response. It should not be sending a 302. I do not understand why I still have to have this discussion with so many hosts, software developers, and providers, but I do. You probably will too. A 503 response is even worse. A 503 response means things are completely broken. That's supposed to mean to a visiting browser or bot, the server is actually broken. It has crashed. It is gone. You do not want to give that response if a page doesn't exist. Again, you want to give a 404 response. If you're getting this response, something is wrong. It needs to be fixed. Now, folks will sometimes look at this and say, oh yeah, that's fine. Google can figure it out. Google has said that they can figure it out. Google has not said that they can figure it out. What Google has said, and this is one of the more subtle rules of being a good technical SEO is don't take what Google says at face value for SEOs. What John Mueller has said, and he's not lying, he's completely accurate, is just do the right technical thing. Just do what makes sense. If a page doesn't exist, your server should respond to 404 with a 404. So anyway, just do it right. Next up is you want to make sure your site has a single canonical address for each resource. This is the biggest technical SEO issue I see on sites every time I look at them, is canonicalization. Now, a site is canonically correct when every unique resource has one address, and there's an old computer definition there. Common causes of canonical problems are send to a friend links, product options, tracking URLs, things like that. You want to check crawl behavior, and one of the main ways to do that is to check your log files. Obviously, your log files can be pretty terrifying. So you want to use something like Screaming Frog's log file analyzer. You can import the log files and then mine them for data. If the files are too large for a client like Screaming Frog, because Screaming Frog can handle, maybe 4 or 5 million lines in a log file at most. A lot of log files can be 40 or 50 million lines, depending on how big a chunk of time you're getting. So you can use grep. Now, grep, I could do an entire training on grep. I'm not going to do that right now, obviously. But this is the basic command. So it's grep -h, which means don't include file names in your output. Look for Googlebot. Open this file and check it. Put the output into output.txt. And you can modify this any way you want. That then reduces the size of the file. Output.txt is much easier for Screaming Frog to handle, and you can go through and mine that instead. That means by doing this, there's no third-party interpretation, right? There's no looking at Google Search Console for duplication. There's no looking at Screaming Frog for duplication. You're looking directly at how bots behave when they crawl your site. They're a very fast look because you can check your log files on a daily basis, and as soon as Google crawls your site again, you'll get a new look at how Google's behaving. So instead of waiting for Search Console or something like that to update, it's much, much quicker. And I've written a whole blog post about this. It's on the Portent site, and it's at this URL, and I think the slides will be up even if half of them didn't display. I apologize again, that's really embarrassing. You can also use Screaming Frog or Serpstat or a lot of other crawlers to just find duplicate content. That's helpful. It's not quite the same thing because search bots may be getting bound up in duplication that other crawlers are not finding. So make sure you do both. And then you're going to find things like this, right? So these are product IDs. These are navigation clicks. Like people sometimes want to check and see, are people clicking on the top level menu? Are they clicking on a link in the page? So they'll add query attributes to the URLs. First of all, don't do that. There's no reason to do that anymore. Any current analytics software can do that for you. Second, it creates huge duplication, so don't do that. UTM source codes, Google tracking codes, sometimes they just get cut and paste into URLs and links. You want to search for those too. They create duplicates. And then someone's going to come to you and say, hey, why don't we just use rel canonical? Because let's face it, it's a much easier fix, right? You just go in and add this tag to each page. Well, it doesn't really work. And the reason it doesn't work is because Google is not a search and SEO service, right? They are a website service. They are a crawler. So you'll get hints like this or notes like this where Gary Iles says, oh, by the way, rel canonical is a hint, not a directive, which means if you use rel canonical, it's not necessarily going to fix the problem. So what you want to do is actually fix it. It's a lousy workaround for canonical problems. Most workarounds that Google gives you are lousy workarounds for problems. I can do a whole other webinar on that. I'm about to start ranting. I'm not going to do that because I only have like 15 minutes left, so I'm just going to keep going. You can fix most canonical problems that are created by URL attributes by adding fragments. So here we've got something like info request.html ? nav equals top. Maybe you still want the nav equals top. Maybe that is the only way that you can track clicks on individual links on pages. Great. Then instead of using question marks, use hashes where you have hash symbol nav equals top. And then you can modify your site code to actually pass that along to whatever your analytics software is. And you can do it using something like window.location.hash, which is a jQuery tool. Also, always check your server headers. And notice I'm still on canonicalization here because it's such a big technical issue, but I have had times when I'm trying to figure out why crawl behavior is not updating on a site, and I've removed rel canonical or I've updated rel canonical or something else, and I can't figure out why it's not working. And somehow, and this happens to me every time, no matter how many times I've done this, 4 hours later, I'll finally look at the server headers, and remember how curl worked, right? It shows you the server response, including the headers. If you look and you see something like this in the server header, that means a canonical directive is being delivered using the header. So the rel canonical tag probably isn't doing anything. It's probably actually the header that's doing it. And you need to go in and you need to change that header. Then you've just handled exact duplicates, right? You've handled canonical problems. There's also problems of near duplicates, where you have member profiles or bios or pages that are, you know, grouped and categorized content, whatever else. These pages are near duplicates. No, I have no good formula for what is too much of a duplicate and what is not, you know, what is okay. What I do have, though, is this thing that J.R. Oakes put together that is brilliant. You need to read every single thing this guy has ever written, except that it makes me feel stupid. So maybe don't until you've seen how brilliant I am. That sounded completely wrong, but anyway. He provides a tool that will actually look for near duplicates. And if you look here, the higher the score, the more likely it is that something is a duplicate. This is an absolutely priceless tool because it will let you look and find those pages that are approaching thin or near duplicate content. And again, you can't look at a number here and say, oh, it's higher than 0.26. This is a problem. But you can look and start to see alarm bells, right? I've got all these pages with high scores, all these pages with low scores. This is bad. This is good. And then you can actually import this and combine it with regular log file data. And in Screaming Frog, there's just an import URL data. And I can just import, say, the shingling data, the stuff that J.R. Oakes gives you, with the crawl data, with the log file data, and all of a sudden I have everything put together in one place. So I can see all the different ways that Googlebot has hit a particular page at the same time that I look at SimScore, which is the score from the shingling spreadsheet that I just showed you. So you're putting all this data together into one place. It gets much easier to take kind of that high level look. Next up is server performance. Server performance is a weird one for me because it's not just a technical SEO issue. It's a technical issue that impacts SEO, which is me kind of, I know, kind of making little teeny distinctions that probably don't matter that much. But what performance is it's a multiplier. So it improves user experience, it improves crawl economy, which a lot of people call crawl budget. How much time does Google have to spend crawling your site, and rendering, which I'll get to in a little bit. It is very, very important because if you think about how SEO works and what Google has said about rankings, they say that mobile user experience is important now. User experience is important. What's a major factor of mobile user experience? Speed. So they may say, well, speed's not a primary ranking factor. Great, but it happens to impact 3 or 4 other primary ranking factors. And there's all the basic stuff of site speed, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these. I'm going to assume that you've put some time in on these, or if not, you can go research them. Time to first byte, page size and payload, things like that. What I am going to do is crank up the nerd factor a little bit. If anyone knows me, they know this is my most favorite animal in the world. Sorry, cats. Capybara. Right? They are the nerds of the animal kingdom. That's why I like them. They're just so chill, and yet they're nerds. Anyway, the best way to check site performance is this tool called Lighthouse. And the best test to do with Lighthouse is to use it command line. Because if you use Lighthouse, say using Chrome, then whatever plugins you have running in Chrome could potentially interfere with performance. You're going to get inaccurate numbers. If you use Lighthouse on the command line, you're not going to get that. Also, you can automate it and run it on multiple pages if you want to. And there's some documentation on it there. So here's how you run it, right? You just say, please run it on this page. You can just use this exact string if you want to. And then it gives you this set of scores. And I'm putting this in here so that you understand you get the 0 to 100 score, and people will look at that 0 to 100 score and they'll freak out about it. It's important to understand the individual parts of the score and understand how much weight they can lend to the score itself. So, for example, there's time to interactive, right, which is 14.4 seconds. If you look here, time to interactive is pretty important. That is not the same as download time. So, someone may show the HAR, the HTTP archive, and say, look, our page loads in 2 seconds. Yeah, look at how long it takes for your page to become fully interactive. 14.4 seconds, that's ghastly, that's abominable. All right, that is, well, anyway, that's not good. So then you can look further down the page in Lighthouse and you can see what is taking all that time. And here it's something like, say, script evaluation or CSS. And when you look at that, that's when you can go and you can start using DevTools. So I can go into DevTools and I'll show the console drawer. And again, you can explore all this afterwards. Don't panic if you've not used this before. Then I go to code coverage. And what coverage shows me is how much of the code in a JavaScript file am I actually using. So for example, and by the way, this is bicycling.com. I'm not afraid to pick on them. And they'll probably get mad at me someday, but you can hear the story if you want to another time. Coverage is showing you what percentage of the code in a JavaScript file is actually being used on a page. So for example, here, it's showing me that the bicycling.com JavaScript and CSS, we're only using 67% of it. Here's another site where we're only using 7 or 6.2% of the JavaScript loaded in a 600 kilobyte file. Now, the file size is important, but what's more important is that my browser has to parse all of that JavaScript and all of that CSS and go through all of that code and pick out what's most important before I can actually start doing anything with the page. If you're only using 7% of the code, then why don't you just include 7% of the code and get rid of the rest? It's never that simple, but you should be able to, there should be some happy medium. And if you can do that, obviously it's going to deliver a much better mobile experience. It's going to improve rendering time. It just provides a far better experience for users. And yeah, Google's going to pick up on that pretty quickly. Which brings me to rendering time. And again, sorry, brings me to render. Rendering is a whole separate challenge that I see come up a lot, especially because of JavaScript, which a lot of people are going to talk about. I will talk about in a second. But understand that it's not just JavaScript, it's just how easy is it for a client, a browser or a bot, to interpret and read each page on a site. So first question is, does your site deliver correct code? Right? This is invalid, and I see this on a lot of sites now. I think there's something that WordPress is doing now where it has an alt attribute and it's not even empty. There's just no attribute after it. That is invalid code, and a browser has to then try and figure that out. If you have one of those tags on a page, that's not great. I'll bet if you have 100 of those, it's actually causing problems when a browser tries to parse and render that page. White space and code bloat. This is a real site, and I had to trim it down because it wouldn't fit on my screen. 11,000 lines of HTML, 224 kilobytes of code to deliver a page that has like 30 products on it. I'm sorry, that's completely unacceptable. And by the way, white space is still space. It's still characters. Your browser still has to parse it. And it adds to the size of a page. Redundant divs, where you have div, embedded again and again and again. It's another thing that can really bloat code. You want to address that as quick as you can. Make sure your site is not a JavaScript shit show. And I'm sorry, but that's just what it is, because so many people abuse server-side or client-side JavaScript. I'm not going to go into all the technicalities of React and Angular and everything else. JavaScript rendered client-side is a problem. There is no if, there is no argument, there is no debate. It is a problem, and I'm going to show you where Google says it too. Again, this is where you cannot take what Google is saying at face value from an SEO perspective, because Google says, oh yeah, we're getting better and better at handling JavaScript. First of all, they're saying we're getting better and better. That's like saying I'm getting better and better at dancing. Okay, it's just not that great. Second, they're saying that in these things called webmaster hangouts. They're not called SEO hangouts. They're not called rank higher hangouts. They're called webmaster hangouts. Those are there to help webmasters make sure that their content is visible. They are not there, cat alert, number 3. There we go. It's always one cat. I only have two. Like I said, I'm not the crazy cat guy. Webmaster Hangouts are for webmasters. They are not for SEOs. Keep that in mind when you are deciding whether something Google has said in a webmaster hangout is good for SEO or not. Google does not render client-side content, at the same time that it crawls it. It defers the rendering. They say that themselves, all right? I am not just saying that. I'm not throwing that out there, all right? That is something that they say. And John Mueller himself has said this, right? This is not subtle. They are saying that, yes, we treat sites that use JavaScript differently. You don't want to be treated differently. And part of our job as technical SEOs is to make sure that our sites are not treated differently. They are treated the way that every single acceptable site that Google finds is treated. That's what our job is. And Gianluca probably says this the best, right? He says crawling is not indexing, crawling is not parsing, and indexing is not ranking. So you have to think very carefully about how you're using client-side JavaScript. And yes, here's another one because, oh no, sorry, this is John Mueller getting mad at me because I said JavaScript is a problem. I'm not saying I don't like JavaScript, John. I'm sorry, and I'm not beefing with you either, and you're not beefing with me, I know. But anyway, if you want to test a site, use Web Developer Toolbar, go to the site, turn off JavaScript. It's as easy as that. This is an extreme problem, all right? It's not usually this bad. Usually blocks of content will disappear. This one, though, the entire site has disappeared. So something is very wrong there. And Google, again, says that same thing. But what I'm seeing is that that actual JavaScript is required page is being crawled and indexed. Google is actually finding these pages. All right, if they're finding pages that say, oh, JavaScript is required, they're having a hard time with JavaScript. All right, that's all the message that I need. So if you want to mitigate client-side JavaScript rendering, use pre-render, use hybrid rendering, use server-side rendering. There are services out there like prerender.io that will do it for you. If you're using React or something like that, the better way to do this is just render it server-side. But really, the bottom line is only use it if you need it. I mean, client-side JavaScript is there for app and app-like experiences. So you have pages with a large degree of interactivity. You know, endless scrolling, no, it's a bad thing. It's a bad user experience. And again, don't take my word for it. Look at all the testing out there. You don't need to deliver regular static content using JavaScript. Just deliver it on the page. That's all I want. You know, you don't have to get fancy, right? Just keep it simple. Use JavaScript when you need it. You want to make sure your site uses correct schema markup, right? And this is the last bit, and this one's pretty straightforward. But in Screaming Frog, and I think in Serpstat and a bunch of other tools, you can just check the options, and it will then show you the schema markup for all of your pages. In this case, it's my site, and I'm showing that even after 3 weeks of wrestling with Yoast SEO, I still can't get the right schema markup to show up on my pages. I know it's me, it's not them. I got to figure this one out. It's sort of like me using webinar software, apparently. So that was a lot in a very short time. Keep in mind that a technical audit really looks at 3 things, right? Build, crawl, and render. This is really the checklist I just gave you. Measurement, maintenance, server configuration, canonicalization, performance, code, and rendering. Those are the 7 things that I just went over. There's a ton of little tiny things in there, but if you just think about that and just kind of chill when you start your technical audit, you should be fine, because you're just going to go down that list one step at a time. Don't try to do them all at once. And just remember that technical SEO maximizes visibility and minimizes work. And also, somebody asked me what my favorite SEO cantrips are. Grep, curl, and detect bullshit are my favorite cantrips. If you're not a Dungeons & Dragons player, you're not going to know what this means. But I can cast any one of those as many times a day as I want. So I find those to be really, really helpful. And that's it. Thank you all. If you need to contact me, like for slides that you didn't see, that's my email address, my Twitter handle, and also my website address. Thanks, everybody.